It was a warm summer evening when everything started to change. Olivia had been married to Greg for over 15 years, and their life had settled into a comfortable routine. They had 2 kids, a cozy home in the suburbs, and a marriage that was more of a partnership than the passionate love it had once been. Greg had always been a good husband, reliable, loving, and considerate, but over the years, the fire between them had dimmed. Still, Olivia was content, or so she thought. Then came Logan, the new neighbor. He moved in with little fanfare, just a few blocks away, but close enough that Greg and Logan struck up a friendship. Logan was in his early 40s, recently divorced, and had a relaxed charm that Olivia couldn't help but notice. He often joined them for barbecues and game nights, his laughter filling their backyard in a way that was oddly comforting. Olivia found herself enjoying his presence, more than she expected to. It was all innocent at first. Logan was easy to talk to, and their conversations flowed effortlessly. They'd discuss everything from local politics to favorite books, and over time, Olivia began to feel something different, a spark, a subtle excitement she hadn't felt in years. It was nothing she could place at first, just a feeling that lingered after Logan left. She brushed it off as silly, an overactive imagination. But one evening, everything changed. Greg had invited Logan over for dinner, as usual. The night had started with laughter, stories, and glasses of wine. Olivia sat across from Logan, and at some point during the evening, she noticed how his gaze lingered a little too long on her, how his hand brushed hers when they passed the salad bowl. It was so brief, so fleeting, but it sent a shiver down her spine. She glanced at Greg, who was oblivious, caught up in a conversation about work. Later that night, after the kids had gone to bed and Greg had drifted off in front of the TV, Logan offered to help Olivia clean up. The kitchen was dimly lit, and the soft hum of the dishwasher filled the room. As they stood side by side, washing dishes, their hands bumped together again. This time, neither of them pulled away. Logan turned toward her, his voice low. "Olivia, there's something I've been meaning to say," he began, his eyes searching hers. She froze, her heart racing. This was dangerous, she knew it. But there was something about Logan that made her want to step closer instead of away. "What is it?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Logan hesitated, his hand lingering on hers just a moment too long. "I feel like we've had this connection. I don't know if you feel it too, but it's been driving me crazy. I know I shouldn't say anything, but I can't help it." Olivia's breath caught in her throat. She did feel it. That pull, that spark. It had been there for weeks, quietly building, but she hadn't wanted to admit it, even to herself. She glanced at Greg in the other room, still asleep, oblivious to the tension now crackling between her and Logan. "We shouldn't be talking about this," she whispered, stepping back slightly. But her feet felt glued to the floor, her body betraying her rational mind. Logan took a step closer. "I know, but I can't stop thinking about you, Olivia. I can't pretend I don't feel this." His words sent a rush of heat through her, a heat she hadn't felt in years. She wanted to run, to end this before it went too far, but she couldn't move. Instead, she stood there, feeling the weight of his gaze, the intensity of his words. Olivia swallowed hard, her mind racing, torn between the safety of what she knew and the dangerous allure of what was right in front of her. Her marriage to Greg had been solid, dependable, but this moment with Logan, it was electric. She felt alive in a way she hadn't for years, and that realization frightened her. "We can't, Logan," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I'm married. Greg, he's a good man. I love him." Logan's eyes softened, and for a brief moment, she saw hesitation in his expression. He wasn't trying to ruin her marriage, at least it didn't seem that way. He stepped back, giving her space, but his gaze never left hers. "I know," he said softly. "I'm not trying to mess things up for you, for your family. I had to say it. I had to be honest about how I feel." Olivia felt her heart pound as the silence between them grew heavier. She should have said something then, something final that would close the door on whatever this was, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, she stood there, feeling the weight of her conflicted emotions. Finally, Logan turned away, his shoulders slumping slightly, as if he'd accepted that this moment had passed. He picked up the dish towel, drying his hands before offering her a small, almost sad smile. "I'm sorry if I made things awkward," he said quietly. "I didn't mean to." Olivia shook her head, still too dazed to form a coherent response. "It's okay," she managed to say. I need some time to think." Logan nodded, his expression unreadable. He grabbed his jacket from the chair and headed toward the door. "I'll see you both tomorrow, I guess," he said, pausing for a moment as if waiting for her to say something more. When she didn't, he gave a small nod and left, the sound of the front door clicking shut echoing through the quiet house. Olivia stood alone in the kitchen, her mind swirling. She turned toward the living room, where Greg was still sound asleep, completely unaware of the conversation that had just taken place. She felt a pang of guilt wash over her, followed by a wave of confusion. She loved Greg, didn't she? But then why did Logan's words affect her so deeply? That night, as she lay in bed beside her husband, Olivia couldn't stop replaying the conversation in her head. She felt the tension of Logan's touch still lingering on her skin, the way his eyes had looked at her with such raw emotion. It was intoxicating and terrifying all at once. But she had to push it aside. She had a family, and this wasn't something she could let happen. But the next day, as she saw Logan across the street, his gaze meeting hers for just a moment longer than necessary, she knew that this was far from over. The days that followed were a confusing blur for Olivia. She tried to focus on her usual routine, but Logan's presence lingered in the back of her mind like a constant shadow. Every time she saw him, whether it was a casual wave from across the street or during another dinner with Greg, there was an unspoken tension between them. Each glance, each subtle brush of hands, sent her heart racing in a way she couldn't control. Greg remained blissfully unaware of the storm brewing beneath the surface. He had no reason to suspect anything. After all, Logan had become a regular in their lives, a close friend. But for Olivia, every interaction with Logan felt loaded, charged with the weight of what they hadn't said, what they hadn't done yet. One evening, about a week after their conversation in the kitchen, Greg mentioned that he had to leave town for a couple of days on business. It wasn't unusual for him to travel, but this time, the news filled Olivia with a strange mix of dread and anticipation. The idea of being alone with Logan just next door sent her mind into a spiral. The night Greg left, Logan texted her, "Is everything okay? You seemed quiet earlier." Olivia stared at the message, her fingers hovering over the screen. She knew she should brush him off, keep the distance between them, but instead, she found herself typing back, "I'm fine, just thinking about a lot of things." The response was immediate. "Do you want to talk about it? I'm here if you need someone to listen." Olivia's heart raced as she read the message. Her mind was screaming at her to stop, to pull back before this went too far, but there was another part of her, a part she had kept buried for years, that craved this attention, this connection. She found herself typing again. "Can you come over?" It didn't take long before there was a knock at the door. Olivia opened it to find Logan standing there, his expression soft but filled with concern. The moment felt surreal, and for a brief second, she thought about telling him to leave, that this was a mistake. But the words wouldn't come. Instead, she stepped aside, letting him in. They sat down in the living room, the silence between them thick and charged. Logan didn't press her, didn't ask what was on her mind, and that somehow made it worse. The tension that had been simmering for weeks now hung in the air like a heavy fog, and Olivia could feel it closing in on her. Finally, she broke the silence. "Logan, I don't know what I'm doing. All of this is wrong," she said, her voice shaky. Logan leaned forward, his eyes never leaving hers. "I know it's complicated, Olivia, but it's not wrong to feel something. I can't pretend like there's nothing here. Can you?" His words hit her like a punch to the chest.
She couldn't pretend.
She had tried, but every time she saw him, every time she thought about him, it was like a door she couldn't close. She didn't know if it was excitement or loneliness, or maybe a little bit of both, but whatever it was, it had taken root deep inside her, and she couldn't ignore it anymore. "I don't know what to do," she whispered, tears stinging her eyes. Logan reached out, taking her hand in his. His touch was gentle, reassuring, and yet it sent a jolt of electricity through her. "We don't have to figure it all out right now," he said softly. "I just want to be here for you, however you need." Before she could stop herself, Olivia leaned into him, her head resting on his shoulder. The warmth of his body was comforting, and for the first time in a long while, she allowed herself to feel something other than guilt. She wasn't sure how long they sat like that, but at some point, Logan's hand began to stroke her arm, slow and deliberate. The touch was innocent enough, but it felt anything but. And then, without warning, Logan tilted her chin upward, their eyes locking in the dim light of the room. For a moment, everything hung in the balance. Olivia could still walk away. She could tell him to leave, end this now before it crossed a line. But as Logan's face inched closer, she found herself leaning in, closing the distance between them. Their lips met softly at first, a tentative kiss that sent shivers down her spine. Olivia's heart raced, and for a split second, she pulled back, gasping for air. But the pull between them was undeniable, and before she could stop herself, she kissed him again, this time deeper, more urgent. Logan responded immediately, his hands sliding up to cup her face as the kiss deepened. The world outside disappeared, and all that remained was the two of them, tangled in this moment of desire and confusion. Olivia's thoughts blurred as the kiss deepened, her body reacting instinctively, drowning in the overwhelming rush of emotions she hadn't felt in years. The weight of her marriage, of Greg, was there, but it was muted, pushed to the edges of her mind as Logan's touch took over. His hands moved gently but firmly, tracing the contours of her face, her neck, pulling her closer until there was no space left between them. They broke apart for just a moment, their foreheads resting against one another, both breathless. Olivia's heart pounded, her pulse racing in her ears. She knew they had just crossed a line, one she could never undo, and the realization filled her with both fear and desire. "I shouldn't be doing this," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Logan didn't answer right away. He gently brushed a strand of hair away from her face, his fingers lingering on her skin. His touch was so tender, so careful, as though he knew the weight of what they were doing. "I don't want to hurt you, Olivia," he said softly, his voice laced with emotion. "But I can't pretend that this isn't real. I can't deny what I feel for you." Olivia's eyes filled with tears.
She didn't know what to say.
The truth was, she couldn't deny it either. There was something between them, something that had taken root and grown quietly, and now it was too strong to ignore. But that didn't make it right. "I love Greg," she murmured, more to herself than to Logan. The words felt hollow, though, as if they didn't carry the weight they once did. She did love her husband, she knew that. But this moment, this connection with Logan, was something different, something she hadn't felt in so long. It scared her how much she wanted it. Logan's hands gently cupped her face, pulling her focus back to him. "I'm not asking you to leave him, or to make any decisions right now. I had to be honest. I care about you more than I've cared about anyone in a long time." Olivia's breath hitched, and she felt the sting of guilt in her chest, battling with the desire that coursed through her. "This can't happen again," she said weakly, though even as she said it, she wasn't sure she believed it. Logan nodded slowly, understanding in his eyes, though there was a flicker of sadness too. He leaned in once more, brushing his lips softly against hers in one last kiss, this time slower, filled with a tenderness that made her heart ache. When they pulled apart, the silence between them was heavy, the weight of what they had just done settling over them like a thick fog. Without another word, Logan stood, backing away slowly, giving her space. Olivia watched him go, her heart aching in a way she hadn't expected. She felt hollow, torn between the life she had built with Greg and the undeniable connection she had just shared with Logan. As the door clicked shut behind him, Olivia was left alone in the dimly lit living room, the warmth of Logan's touch still lingering on her skin. She sank down onto the couch, burying her face in her hands, trying to make sense of what had just happened. For hours, She sat there in the quiet, her mind spinning. The guilt weighed heavily on her chest, but there was something else too, a strange, terrifying sense of relief. For the first time in years, she had allowed herself to feel something deeply, to step outside of the boundaries of her predictable life. And it left her feeling conflicted and unsure of what came next. The next few days were a blur. Olivia avoided Logan, unsure of how to face him after what had happened. When Greg returned from his trip, everything seemed normal on the surface, but inside, Olivia felt like she was falling apart. Every time Greg touched her, she flinched inwardly, consumed by the guilt of what she had done. Yet, at the same time, there was a part of her that still craved the connection she had shared with Logan. Days turned into weeks, and Olivia tried to push the memory of that night out of her mind, to focus on her marriage and her family. But it was always there, lingering just beneath the surface, waiting for a moment of weakness to resurface. Then, one evening, as Olivia was preparing dinner, Greg walked into the kitchen with a familiar smile. "Guess who invited us over for dinner tomorrow?" he said casually, setting his keys down on the counter. Olivia's heart sank. "Logan?" she asked, her voice barely concealing her unease. Greg nodded, oblivious to her tension. "Yeah, he thought it'd be nice to have a little get-together. I told him we'd be there." Olivia forced a smile, though inside, her stomach churned. She couldn't avoid Logan forever, and now, she would have to face him, with Greg by her side. The next evening came quickly, and as Olivia and Greg made their way to Logan's house, she felt the weight of her decision pressing down on her. When Logan opened the door, his eyes met hers for just a moment too long, a silent acknowledgement of what had passed between them. But he greeted them both warmly, acting as though nothing had ever happened. Throughout dinner, Olivia could hardly focus. Her mind was racing, filled with guilt, desire, and confusion. Every time Logan spoke to her, she felt a pull, a longing that terrified her. But she kept her composure, playing the part of the loving wife, all while wondering what the future held for her, for Logan, and for Greg. As the night wore on, Olivia knew that this story was far from over, and the resolution, if it ever came, would not be easy. Whatever happened next, it would leave them all changed.